Let's switch over here and talk a little bit about some time-saving tips for a game master. If you watched my video about an hour ago, I didn't have the sound on, so I apologize. So this is a replication. I'm Game Master Jay, and we're talking about some storyteller shortcuts, time-saving tips for game masters. First one I want to talk about is you want to condense your materials to make it easier for you to handle them. So I recommend putting story elements on 3x5 cards. Maybe it's a setting, maybe it's a location, maybe it's a climatological thing, maybe it's climatological. The idea is to have these story elements on 3x5 cards so you can make note of it, describe it, and set it aside so you can get through the various scenes in rapid succession and move from one to the other. A second thing to have is a convenient list of NPC names. And I actually, if you're in a urban setting, I recommend having a multiplicity of them because you'll have different, for example, certain cultural naming conventions. You might have 3 or 4 names that are of a different species that you might need to have handy. And the idea is to have those lists already prepped so that you can simply look to a note and blurt it out rather than have to, in the case of running a game live, having to go and look up a website where you can find a random generator, blah, blah, blah. So the idea is that you want to have those names prepped so that the players can interact even with personas that you expected to be window dressing. Maybe you mention something in passing, but the players find that person to be fascinating, so they want to go and talk with them, and now you'll have a name for them. The idea of having it already prepped is that you're able to more rapidly move seamlessly into each interaction. This third one is more for people who prefer to run pre-generated adventures, what they used to call modules, or the book versions of campaigns and such. Make sure you pre-read your materials as necessary beforehand so that you're familiarized. By having a pre-read and an awareness of the setting and the scenes, your delivery will be more efficient. You'll be able to answer questions more rapidly, and you won't have to spend a lot of time looking things up, which detracts from the speed of the game and also undermines some of your credibility as a game master because you're going to be perceived as depending on the book for answers to questions. This next one is particularly for crunchy games such as Dungeons & Dragons 5e or Pathfinder, where there are a lot of rules requirements. Make sure that you've already set up one thing you can do is have a sheet of pre-rolled dice values of each denomination. So you got a page of 100s and a page of D6s and a page of D8s or whatever, so that as you're resolving attack values for say 4 or 5 monsters at a time, you can look across there and just line out the die rolls as you use them, and then apply the results as if you had physically just rolled them. And it makes it so that the game master's time of doing the mechanics of the game is cut down considerably. Granted, the players have to choose which of the villains they're going to fight or whatever, but if you're having them fight hordes of monsters, then the hordes of monster die rolls should be more quickly handled, and so therefore having pre-rolled numbers makes that a breeze. In like fashion, if you are playing a game where your scenes are generic and random and the locale is not particularly well known by the players, having some pre-created battle mats or maps are indispensable, especially if you're like I am. I've got 3 or 4 of these large-scale map books so that I can, at a moment's notice, have an oceanfront scene or perhaps a deep jungle or even a city block. This idea of having it pre-created maps means that you could drop it on the table and just go to town with your players using their miniatures or tokens or whatever to show where they are so that they can have a better idea of what their options are. Now, this is not always the case. I prefer theater of the mind, but especially with newer players, it's sometimes easier to have a map so they can physically see where they are. It also tends to help with, in particular, the action magnets that I spoke of earlier, that if you're utilizing the map mechanism, you can simply point there over there, and the actual action's over here. And therefore, gives them the opportunity to become more aware of situational awareness. Another fun thing to do that I would highly recommend that makes your games go faster is have handouts of the poems, poetry, or puzzles, prompts that you have for the players, because then they have a tangible piece to look at and to hold in their hand. And if you've created a specific map, or for example, and you've provided to them as a rolled up scroll, then they get to interact with it as if it was that item, which makes the role play a little bit more rich, a little bit more tangible. And also, by having multiple copies of the riddles or poems, then the players can look at it at their leisure and not have to keep arguing it between themselves about who has it or who's carrying it at this moment, which again tends to break up the flow of your game sessions. Another thing that's really useful to have is player table tents and a means of marking their initiative. I use, for example, I use playing cards where I'll have a set of, say I've got 6 players, I'll have 6 cards numbered 1 through 6, and then the players can just lay that out beside their table tent and will know what their order is. This is particularly handy in roleplay games like Dungeons and Dragons, where the initiative is set for the entire afternoon with the first die roll. Or you can actually pull the cards back, shuffle them up, and just hand them out. And therefore, you get it done in a relative hurry, and you can get on to the action of the round by simply calling out the first player and getting their action. When you do these two, they tend to make it so the players use the persona name and get familiar with who's playing whom, and it also gives the idea of first, second, third, and therefore it cuts down on the amount of analysis paralysis or the Thunder Stealers, we get Thunder Thieves, because they can see who's going next and what action's been done, and therefore they can pick their next action in a quicker way. Also helps with your Slowpoke McGillicuddies, because they'll have all the time up until their initiative to make their decisions. The final one I want to talk about is to have a short run sandglass. And I think the one I took was from a Boggle game or whatever. They have a 3-minute or 5-minute counter that you can literally turn over and watch the sand fall, so that a player is aware of how limited their time is, and therefore they trigger their actions and decisions much more quickly, and also provides them with the kind of the built-in stressor of the time being short, and therefore they have to be considering all options. Really, what it comes down to is that if you utilize time savings tips, then you're going to have more game time overall for every player. As I've said before, you want to have equitable time play, and using a sandglass for each player tends to give you a rhythm to the session. All right, so apparently I talked right through my own session there, so I'm going to go back and mention the last two. Player table tents are really important because they give you a way for the players to get to know each other's character names. And it also, if you initiate also an initiative marker system, you can determine who's going first, second, third in a turn more easily by having these physical markers that can be laying in front of the players to make it more recognizable and understandable. And then finally, having a sandglass and a little timer, 3-minute timer, 5-minute timer, can allow the players to feel the stresses of needing to act more quickly, because you're only allotting them a certain amount of time to make their decisions. But it also feels more tangible to feel rushed and moving through things. And especially if you've got a combination of analysis paralysis and Slowpoke McGillicuddies, you can actually get past both of them by having a sandglass that monitors the amount of time they have to make decisions. And all of this really comes down to the fact that time savings means more game time. If you have things that are delaying your sessions and you're able to avoid them using some of these recommendations, then you're going to have more time per night and get more actions and more turns through in the game.